Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this episode of National Wildlife Federation All Access Fenced In. I'm Tara Castelucci, Director of Philanthropy. I'm so pleased to be here today with my colleagues Simon Buzzard and Bob McCready to talk about the Federation's efforts to eliminate migratory barriers created by fencing in the West. Before I formally introduce you to Simon and Bob, I want to cover a few housekeeping details first. If at any point you experience internet connectivity issues during the webcast, you may use the link provided in your registration and reminder emails to sign on again. You also have the option of listening to today's webcast by phone. The phone number and conference code are listed on the screen for you and were also provided in those reminder emails. This webcast is being recorded, so you will have the opportunity to watch it at a later time. If you have any issues at all during the webcast, our team is available to assist you on the number on the screen. We have some time reserved for audience questions at the end, and you may submit those questions during today's discussion using the Q&A portal. This should be visible at the bottom of your screen, though you may need to hover your mouse over the screen or tap on your screen for that icon to appear. We will do our very best to address all of the questions over the course of our discussion or during our Q&A segment. However, if we're unable to address all the questions, please know that we will follow up with you after the event. And now, without further ado, it's time for me to introduce you to our experts. Based in Missoula, Montana, Simon leads the Federation's work in the Northern Rockies to conserve and restore migration routes for declining populations of pronghorn, mule deer, and other species that are in critical need of connected landscapes. Simon has been leading the Federation's wildlife-friendly fence modification and removal projects in the High Divide of Southwest Montana since 2021. He also coordinates closely with state and federal agency partners, as well as other conservation organizations, to implement wildlife accommodation projects on Montana roadways to improve connectivity. Simon has an undergraduate degree from the University of Oregon and a Master's of Science in Environmental Studies from the University of Montana. Simon, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.
Based in Boulder, Colorado, Bob is acting director of the Western Wildlife Programs for the National Wildlife Federation. He supports our regional connectivity program and leads the Wildlife Conflict Resolution Program. In that role, he negotiates retirement of public land grazing permits with ranchers across the Rockies, Great Basin, and the Southwest. Bob also works on wolf reintroduction in Colorado. He has spent over 30 years managing large private and public lands conservation projects worldwide, including in Latin America, Indonesia, and Mongolia. And Bob has spent his career with the Nature Conservancy, Playa Lakes Joint Venture, and the Federation. Bob is currently negotiating 2 public grazing allotment retirements in Colorado and Nevada, and he has an undergraduate degree from the University of Montana and graduate degrees in natural resources management and geography from the University of Washington. Bob, welcome.
Everybody.
Thank you both so much for joining me today to discuss this really exciting connectivity work. Bob, I'd like for you to start by perhaps setting the scene for our viewers a bit. And can you explain a bit about migration and why it's so important to wildlife?
Sure. And first, I'd like to say, Simon is our connectivity expert. But I will, in the next few minutes, just give you an overview. First, migration, whether it's humans or animals, means movement across a landscape or landscapes. We as humans, when we go to Arizona for the winter, we do that to escape the cold weather. Animals migrate for similar reasons. They do it to find necessary food and shelter, to reproduce. Migration is really a product of evolution and natural selection, and it helped animals take advantage of different areas across 2 or more seasons. In addition to moving to find food, animals move to take advantage of or avoid certain climate conditions. These migration routes and patterns persisted because they were successful ways for animals to survive, really, to take advantage of good conditions that supported successful reproduction. These migration patterns or routes are passed down from generation to generation, and they persist across time. I'm sure we could all sit here and name a number of species that migrate, but a few that come to mind right now to me are birds, butterflies, whales, sea turtles, salmon, many large ungulates like the wildebeest in Africa. I think many of us grew up watching Mutual of Omaha and other nature shows. The wildebeest migration was iconic, but we want to point out here today, we have somewhat similar large ungulate migrations in North America. Pronghorn, mule deer, elk, to name a few. Tara.
Thanks for that, Bob. And so what are some of the primary challenges to animals that migrate?
Yeah. If we think back, even 150 years, these animals that we're going to be discussing today, they migrated virtually unimpeded. Yes, there were humans on the landscape that hunted them, but the actual movement of these animals was easy, or it was not impeded. There were no significant barriers. Everything has changed over the last 150 or so years in what is today, I think we would all agree, a highly human impacted landscape. And this brings up many challenges for those animals that are moving, and quite honestly, barriers. Perhaps most significant is that for any given species, us today, our concern and the task at hand is to conserve in a linear fashion. Most of this migration happens linearly, is to conserve specific habitat types across that very large area. And in this human-dominated, human-impacted landscape, that gets complicated very, very quickly. Another challenge is we, especially in the West, but this is really true anywhere, we live in and work in a patchwork landscape, a patchwork of ownership and jurisdictions across the West. Here's a great photo of one of the old entrances to Yellowstone National Park. And that makes things complicated. Wildlife clearly don't read maps, and they're certainly not aware when they're crossing, say, the border from Colorado, where I live, into Wyoming. And they're absolutely not aware when they're crossing from Forest Service land to private land to Bureau of Land Management land, et cetera. What this suggests is that we now, to be successful, have to coordinate across multiple entities, governmental and non-governmental. I should point out that, us in the conservation community, with support with our listeners here today, we've been working on protecting migratory species for decades. And in fact, with birds for almost 100 years. 1929 is when we passed in this country the Migratory Bird Act. That's been a hugely high impact piece of legislation over the decades. Among, I think, the guild of avian species that benefited most are waterfowl and shorebirds. Much of the work on migratory bird conservation has been on wetlands and other aquatic areas that are important to those couple of groups of species. One advantage birds have, obviously, and we're seeing it on this image right now, they have wings. That gives birds the ability to fly over degraded habitat, to fly over these barriers. Terrestrial wildlife move using their legs, and they do not have this advantage. So we are forced to think about, how do we connect the habitat on which these animals rely while they're moving? Every inch of that land they're not utilizing, that they're moving across. There are breeding areas, there are often calving areas, wintering areas that they're utilizing across that entire migration, piece of their life cycle. That being said, they do have to move across these barriers that can be very dangerous, or they actually cannot move through. Simon will be talking about some specific examples of that in a little bit. NWF has been a leader on terrestrial migratory species conservation over the decades. in the Northern Rockies, for example, we've brought back from the brink all of the large mammals, including the top food chain predators such as wolves and grizzlies. And something I would like to point out is, and I didn't know this, and I think many of you may not either, in North America, we almost extirpated completely all of our large ungulates. We just hunted them into near extinction 120, 130, 140 years ago. We have largely recovered most of those large ungulates. We all know the story of the bison. We have for the most part not recovered that species, although we're doing some good work on that on them. But in terms of the other large ungulates, whether it's pronghorn, elk, mule deer, etc., we've recovered pretty decent populations and quite good populations in some areas, using elk as an example. Pronghorn and mule deer, we are witnessing pretty significant declines over the last couple of decades. Pronghorn is going to be a species you hear more about from Simon in a minute. But the work to recover these species has been amazing. But I will say, just to remind us again, that our job is not getting any easier. With the increasing pace of human development, we're seeing more roads, fences, buildings, mines, farmland. It's just getting harder and harder for these animals to move through these landscapes. On top of that, we have climate change, which amplifies all of these problems.
Wow. Well, that's a lot that our wildlife have to navigate for sure. I'm curious, Bob, in the course of your career, what progress have you seen with regards to protecting, especially those terrestrial animals that rely upon these migration routes?
I'll be the first to admit, over much of my career, the challenges that I've laid out cause all of us in the conservation community to probably do less on some of these long distance migrating species than we could have otherwise done. I will say, in our defense, we had less tools, to address these problems. So we wound up working on the landscape here. We didn't really work too much on the actual barriers, or removing or addressing barriers to movement to these animals. And then we would say work on, the habitat in the northern, latitudes on which they relied. I will say, and this is probably only in the last 6, 7, 8 years, migration and connectivity conversation has become hot. It's very exciting. It's finally garnering the attention and the interest, and quite honestly, the resources that are necessary to make an impact. This is due to a whole bunch of things. I think a lot of it is technology, including GPS collar technology, satellite telemetry technology, has improved to the point where we, as biologists that work on these issues, better understand how these wildlife move. What are the barriers to their movement across these migration routes? And that's allowed us to develop more effective, more efficient strategies to address those barriers to movement. Another positive development, and I alluded to this earlier, is that in order to be successful, we have to work across multiple jurisdictions and entities. And I think across the federal agencies, the state wildlife agencies, the NGO community, there's increasing recognition that no one can do this alone. No single entity can work across all of these areas from north to south. And so that's fantastic. I mean, that's happening, and we're very excited about that, and that's helping us do better work.
Thanks, Bob, for sharing that great news. I would like to know, it's great that the organizations and agencies are working together and focusing on this. And how is the Federation in particular working on the ground to help remove barriers to migration?
Well, you're going to hear a lot more about that from Simon, just one example here in a few minutes. But in general, it's satisfying and gratifying to work with an organization that's on the forefront of this. And NWF very much is that organization. And like I said, we've been working on some of these issues for decades, but we are really investing heavily in this, and have been over the last 6 or 7 years. One example, a person that's not on this call, our colleague Jeremy Romero, works for NWF in New Mexico. He's leading our connectivity conservation policy work and having a huge impact. We really need laws at the state level, and federal level that enable, facilitate, encourage, fund all of this work that we're doing. And so Jeremy's leading that effort and making a huge impact. He also spends a lot of his time building coalitions across many different organizations, small, medium, and large NGOs, state agencies, federal agencies, and essentially is helping catalyze a lot of on-the-ground fence removal projects, fence modification projects, road crossings, et cetera. And that's exciting. Here in the Northern Rockies, Simon and his team are designing and implementing on-the-ground projects like all the fencing work that he's going to be talking about in a minute or two.
Great. Thanks for all that information, Bob. And Simon, turning to you, can you paint a picture of what connectivity and migration conservation looks like in the Northern Rockies where you primarily work?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. Thanks, Bob, for that intro. It was great. And thanks everyone for coming. It's really exciting to see our full group here. Yeah, so the Northern Rockies, really what I can distill it down to is our landscape is defined by extremes. So we have extremes in elevation and precipitation and temperature, and so wildlife that are needing to make the most of that situation really have to move to find resources. And for ungulates in particular, we call this surfing the green wave. So this is something that has come up in the research as Bob described, where our increases in GPS technology is able to really pinpoint how wildlife are moving. And so this chart you can see in any sort of corridor habitat area, on the x-axis you have time, and on the y-axis you have elevation. And so you see how the elk in this situation are following green up, and they're moving through their corridor habitat and at precise time to maximize that forage potential. And that directly results in their ability to have fat stores that are conducive to for the females to getting pregnant, to surviving the winter, and then having successful offspring. So really their ability to track these resources through time serve them better than those that don't move, for example. So if some stay in an area where, or if they're forced to stay in an area where they can't track this shift in resource availability, they won't survive. So that's, I think something just to, again, show our picture here, paint our picture of the Northern Rockies in the West is this extreme landscape. And I would say, I think in our region, the big example that comes to mind is Yellowstone National Park. And so we have, as Bob mentioned, we've actually lost over 75% of our long distance migrations for elk, pronghorn, and bison. And those that remain, we've been able to sort of rediscover through the use of GPS technology to actually kind of pinpoint exactly how they're moving and when. So timing really is everything, and understanding this reality that wildlife are moving across huge expanses in a very particular way. So this is this captivating map of elk migrations in and out of Yellowstone National Park, and Yellowstone there is in the middle of the map, and that's their summer range. They're moving up into higher elevation to take advantage of that really high quality forage and have their offspring. And then as summer progresses and fall comes in, temperatures start to dip, snow comes on, they have to move down in elevation. And that's why through our, this kind of mapping has happened really in the past 5 to 10 years. And it's really captivated folks. It's very compelling. And it really tells this transboundary story that Bob was talking about. And this is an example. This is why Yellowstone National Park has been described as the beating heart of wildlife migrations in the West, really. So we are generally, I'll get more into this in more detail, but our work right now in the region is focused on the western side of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And this is where, as wildlife are coming out of the park, they're encountering private lands, or this sort of matrix of development that they have to navigate. And so that's really, in the past few years, we've really had a lot of success in raising that awareness that, as Bob mentioned, working across jurisdictions to conserve and restore winter range and seasonal habitat on private lands and those adjoining public lands. So that's, I'd say, I'll get into it more, but our work focuses, on habitat restoration on private lands, including modifying fencing to be more wildlife friendly, and incentivize landowners to change behavior to accommodate wildlife.
That's great, Simon. And I absolutely love that analogy of Yellowstone being the beating heart of migration. That's super cool. So Simon, about fencing in particular, we're hearing more and more and more about fence ecology. And can you tell us what this is and how you first got involved in fence ecology?
Yeah, thanks. So, if we think about on the global scale, the leading cause of biodiversity loss are two things: habitat loss and fragmentation. And so fence ecology is a component of the fragmentation for the most part that we have. Even if you have good habitat for various terrestrial species, if the landscape is fragmented and they can't reach it, those populations are going to decline, and we're going to lose those genetics. So, and that's the loss of biodiversity. So fences specifically have not really been evaluated to a high degree in terms of their impact. It's really been in the past 10 years that this sort of I'd say a movement to understand the effects of fencing, and it's kind of a offshoot of road ecology. And so here, you can see this photo. It's been, anyone who drives a car knows that roads are a problem for wildlife, right? We've either encountered we've either hit animals in our cars, or we've seen wildlife vehicle collision, carcasses, roadkill. And there are a lot of mitigation processes we can take to make roads safer for wildlife, and we do that as part of our work in the Northern Rockies. And so you can see here, there's an underpass that these mule deer are trying to get to cross the road. But in order to get to the road, they have to go through fences. And so you can think of all this huge landscape spreading out from roads that is a matrix of fencing, and they need to navigate that just to get to the spot where they can cross the road. So fence ecology, there's been some major sort of examples of like this issue in globally, and one of them was, I'd say in the 80s, there were these veterinary fences put up across southern Africa, and we saw big declines in multiple species of ungulates like wildebeest and zebra, and they were put up to keep cattle and wildlife separate due to disease concerns. So, but on the other hand, we know that fences are really useful in a lot of ways for wildlife conservation. They protect endemic species from exotic species, like on island, communities where we have introduced ungulates that eat sensitive plants, for example, and fencing off those areas is really important, or to protect wildlife from being poached. So fence ecology kind of tries to understand the ecological impacts and the social dynamics of fences. And for me, it really started early in life. I actually grew up in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa and the Western US. And I got to, luckily, I got to experience the amazing wildlife resources of both of those parts of the world. And there's a lot of parks that are fenced, and it's just very stark when you see that. And then you juxtapose that to areas that are not fenced, like the Serengeti or the Masai Mara is not fenced, and wildlife can move and continue those migrations. And Yellowstone Park, like Bob said, is not fenced. So that had been kind of in my awareness for a long time. And then I actually got to go out on the ground in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and work on fence projects for pronghorn specifically. And so pronghorn are they're the only endemic ungulate to North America. They're the only surviving member of the antelope capra family. So they're not part of the bovid or cervids like other ungulates. So they're not a true antelope. And they are the second fastest land mammal in the world after the cheetah. And they've co-evolved with, these now extinct like fleet predators in North America. But somehow they did not evolve to jump very well. So they're really bad at jumping. They do jump, but they're not good at it. So they have to go under obstacles like fences. And we have this, we have a legacy now across the West that their landscape, their rangeland, like you can see, is crisscrossed by fencing, by roads, by development. And so we have two things going on here. We've got the habitat loss where, you actually have the footprint of houses and, oil and gas fields and roads that are changing the native habitat, in this case, grasslands, into something else. So you're losing that habitat and you're getting that they're having more and more of this fragmentation. So every time can say this with 90% confidence, every time a house goes up in the suburbs or in, the wildlife urban interface, a fence goes up. So you have this fencing that's associated with, even if it's not used for, big ranching, fences go up where houses go up. And so we're increasingly fragmenting the landscape and filling up those spaces that are left. But then to get back to like fence ecology, why I'm doing it, why I'm kind of living, breathing this work, is I also recognize it as it's just really cool that there's solutions, right? There are so many intractable issues that we are faced every day, market forces beyond our control that are driving, climate change and, these massive scale habitat loss that we've mentioned. But fences are something we can, from one day to the next, we can fix. So, it's a tool that people are using to manage something that they use on the landscape. So here's a historic, sheep use this type of fence as a woven wire fence that would be used mainly by sheep ranching, right? And large areas of the West have transitioned from sheep to cattle. So arguably, in most places, you don't need woven wire anymore. And this happens. This is a pronghorn carcass that I found. And they get caught when they jump, when they try to jump, and their back legs got caught in the top two wires. And so we can change this fence from one day to the next and create, a wildlife friendlier fence that allows passage, but still does its job. And so that's one thing I'm really excited about in this work, is that it's a win-win for wildlife and people that we can actually accomplish, across the landscape.
Wow, Simon, that is super interesting information. And it's always hard to see an animal caught up in a fence, but that is the reality. And that's why this work is so important. So thank you for all you do on that. Can you tell us a little bit more about where you're specifically doing this work, and then walk us through like your process and your techniques in starting these projects?
Yeah, sure. So we're mainly focused in Southwest Montana, Northeast Idaho. It's called the region called the High Divide, and it's an area of pretty low human development density between the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, these protected areas of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, the Selway, Bitterroot, and the Crown of the Continent. Now we do have some significant population centers in here: Butte, Missoula, Bozeman, kind of on the edge, and Helena. So there's a lot of private land in this region that acts as important winter range for multiple species of ungulates, like pronghorn, mule deer, elk, moose, as well as sensitive species like sage grouse. And it's also the headwaters of some important rivers in the West, the Yellowstone and the Snake. And so there's a lot of reason to focus our conservation efforts in this landscape, because like Bob said, it's this patchwork, and it requires sort of all hands on deck to manage this for wildlife, and kind of keep the landscape open from just development. So trying to keep working lands viable. And so that's why we have to work hand in hand with, local producers and landowners to make living here still possible for them. And so what we've been able to do, which is really exciting, is we take wildlife movement data, GPS collar data, as Bob mentioned, and we overlay that with fence maps. And so when you do that, you can kind of, a story emerges. So this is a map, sorry, those that are colorblind, but we have red fences on here, and green and yellow are two collared pronghorn does. And you can see as soon as they get inside this sort of square parcel of fence, they bounce around and can't get out. So then we kind of see that, we evaluate that at a, sort of large spatial scales and identify these areas. And then we go out and ground truth what that is. Turns out it's a, over 4 foot tall fence. It's like a 55, probably 52 to 55 inch fence, woven wire with 2 strands of barbed wire. One of the strands has fallen off on the ground. And this is an pretty much impermeable fence. The only way that pronghorn can get through this is if they find a gate that's left open, or if there's like a badger hole or something that they can actually find a spot to get out. So then it's really, from that point, it's really about relationship building and building trust in the community, and being committed to this. So we work with a host of different folks, from volunteers to the Bureau of Land Management, biologists, to the landowners and Fish and Wildlife Service, other NGOs, the Nature Conservancy, local watershed groups. And this is a perfect example of what we do. So the trailer, you can see this is a group of volunteers and some me and some NWF staff. And we're standing in front of 2 miles of woven wire fence that we rolled up and loaded onto this trailer. And the trailer is actually a Bureau of Land Management trailer. So it really demonstrates that partnership effort to get this work done. And that's, we kind of go out and remove a fence like this, and then we replace it with a wildlife friendlier fence that I'll get into a little bit on like what the specifications are. But that on the left side of the screen is the new fence, and that replaced that 2 miles of woven wire. And it's a 4-strand fence with a smooth bottom wire at 18 inches, and that allows for pronghorn to go under, and other species to go under. Juveniles of other species need that clearance under the bottom wire because they can't jump. And then importantly, it has that clearance between the top 2 wires. So it allows that spacing so that if an animal's jumping, they don't get their legs tangled in those wires. The other thing we do that goes a long way and stretches our dollars is to modify a fence. So that's what that group is doing in that second photo. And I'll get into, actually, I've already shown a photo that I'll get back to on pronghorn actually using that fence. So that's kind of that's kind of how we do it.
Great. Well, Simon, you also, talked a little bit about the fences in general and the bottom wire and the top wire. So can you tell us generally what animals your work benefits? And then how do you know what they need? Like, how do you know what fences work for them?
Yeah, thanks. So there's actually been some really good research in the past 5 years, 6 years that we've been involved with to understand these interactions and what specifications of fencing benefits wildlife, but still works for ranchers, which are raising cattle in the landscape. And so pronghorn, like I mentioned, it's been identified that 18 inches on that bottom wire is really important. That allows for, if there's during the wintertime, if there's snow buildup, they can still have clearance under that wire, depending on the area. So having high clearance is really important. And then having the top wire smooth would be ideal, because then you're not getting caught on that. But having those 12 inches is really what's important. So this allows for, we've evaluated this for mule deer, pronghorn specifically, because those are the two, as Bob mentioned, those are the two species that are still struggling to, we saw increases in populations. Now we're starting to see declines. And so mule deer and pronghorn, when they're given the chance, they prefer to go under. And so we want to, but it does give us some flexibility to work with landowners and say, like, okay, if a top wire, smooth wire is not possible, could we do, it allows some flexibility in tailoring the situation to the needs of the landowner. Obviously along roads and things like that, there might be some more hesitant with having a high bottom wire if you have calves. But or if you have cattle in your pasture and you don't want your calves to get out. But I would say for any given ranch or land, any given agriculture operation, somewhere on that ranch, there's an opportunity for this type of fencing. It may not be everywhere, but there's an opportunity for somewhere on that landscape to see where wildlife are using, where they want to be using it, and put in. It doesn't have to be the full, you don't have to replace all of your fences, but we can install this type of fence, with precision, to make the landscape easier for wildlife to move through. As far as your question about, how do we know it benefits? That's a really good question. I think a lot of people, anytime we in the science or conservation community identify a problem, everybody wants to know, like, oh, is it working? Where's the data showing that it's working? And I fully appreciate that. I want to answer the same question as, scientifically as possible. And one of the challenges is that we talk about the technology that's allowed us to get to this point. So we've identified the challenges using mainly really high-tech GPS collar technology that is wildlife research standard right now. And collar studies are really expensive. You're talking several grand per collar on an animal, and they're generally pretty limited in time. And so for this pronghorn project that we were helping the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks to carry out, that's a 3-year study. It's just not very long in the scale of the life cycle of these animals and understanding their complete suite of movements. So I would say we've really identified a lot of the problems. We've been able to calculate which fence segments are more of a problem for movement than others, and then we kind of go out and right now we're doing some anecdotal evidence collection with game cameras to see, like, is this working? So this fence, we replaced the bottom wire it was a 5-strand barbed wire fence, and we took off 2 strands of the lowest wire and replaced with smooth wire here. And we're seeing pronghorn use it in wintertime, and this is exactly when they need to be able to move. They need to be able to move all the time, but this was 4 degrees out, late fall. They need to be able to move and get food, and if they can't, it's a problem for them. So we have plans for kind of evaluating in more detail, some of the large scale efficacy of fence modifications on different migration populations, and that's ongoing.
Great. Simon, I'm curious. So can all this great on the ground habitat restoration work and fence work that you're doing, can that combine with policy in any way to perhaps achieve greater or more widespread results across the West?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're already seeing how these on the ground projects are garnering more attention from all sorts of folks. So the local community we're getting more and more buy-in from local community that this type of fence works and is worth, working with us to do it. we're seeing the land management agencies. So the Bureau, like I mentioned, the Bureau of Land Management, there's different districts, they want to do this work, right? And maybe they may not have the resources to prioritize it. So one of the things that National Wildlife Federation has done at the federal level is we've really championed, the bills in Congress that provide funding, through, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act and the bilateral infrastructure law to send money for conservation on the ground to these districts. So, the Bureau of Land Management in Southwest Montana in the Dillon area is received $9 million in the last, round of funding from the Inflation Reduction Act for conservation habitat improvement. And through the work we've done with them, they have what we call shovel-ready projects. We've identified at least 20 miles of fences that are a problem for pronghorn, and they can just turn, pivot and go out and work on those projects. So that's an example. We're seeing the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the big arm of U.S. Department of Agriculture. They have adopted something called the Big Game Migratory. It's a pilot program coming out of Wyoming, but it's a big game migration program that funds this type of work in priority areas, and that's expanded to Montana and Idaho. And we are helping kind of get that done on the ground, where we're looking at up to 75 miles with 3 different landowners in the Ruby Valley. So we're excited about that. And so it's sort of cascading at this point, and there's a lot of opportunity to have this sort of partnership approach. As you can see in this slide, we're now having ranchers come to us, and that's been really exciting. We've created more outreach materials and trying to get the word out on how we do this and what's available, and we're working alongside other agencies to offer similar to what they do, and not try to duplicate efforts, but really come together and offer that sort of synergistic approach to get this done. And I would say there's another exciting opportunity here with some novel technology. There's this new technology for fencing that's virtual, where you would put collars on cattle and actually, create pastures remotely with your, iPad. And that could lead to the elimination of hard fencing on the landscape. And so this is kind of still in testing to determine the technology and infrastructure to help folks see if it works. And we're actually helping pilot a project in central Montana right now. And so this has the potential to really revolutionize fencing the way that barbed wire did in the late 1800s. And so we're really excited about this opportunity. And then one more note on the policy side, we have seen states like in Wyoming, we've seen corridors, mule deer and pronghorn corridors, migration corridors actually be designated, at the state level. And that has been really exciting because it identifies clear ways that, communities and state agencies and federal agencies work together on conservation projects to conserve these corridors. So there's definitely more opportunity for that.
Wow. Thank you, Simon, so much. This is so much great information. One final question for you, Bob, before we turn this over to our audience. Do you have any final thoughts about NWF's work?
Yeah, a few observations come to mind. One is every time I hear Simon talk about this work, I get even more excited. I mean, really, it's thrilling. I know we are faced with so much bad news, those of us that are focused on conservation and are environmentalists. And, even though we have a tall task ahead of us, I mean, I am excited to watch this work develop over the coming 3, 4, 5 years. I mean, there's just so much happening that is positive. We need all the support we can get, but it's a very exciting moment in time. We can't say that about every field in the conservation endeavor. Another thing that I thought of is, with NWF, our credibility and effectiveness is really due to our culture of rooting everything we do in a highly science-based approach. I think Simon's work is emblematic of that. The evolution, the evolving technology, the most recent of which is this virtual fence technology. We need to be on top of that if we want to take advantage of it and apply it to our conservation, implementation. And I think we're doing that. It's one of the reasons we're looked to as a leader in this field. Another, idea or thought is that collaboration is our brand at the National Wildlife Federation. We have always worked well with others. I can't say that's always true for other organizations, including some that I've worked for, but it is part and parcel of the way we do business at NWF, and that will serve few programs better than this one, because we need to work with so many different organizations and agencies. We will continue. I mean, this is a perfect example of looking for win-win solutions. When I hear ranchers are asking us to work with them, I know we are winning. We're being successful. That is the sweet spot for conservation in the American West. The landscape is a patchwork, like we've said, of federal land and private land, and we are not going to change that anytime soon. And so we have to work within those realities and being able to have, quite honestly, the emotional and social intelligence to work well and collaboratively with private landowners in these very, very large landscapes and our partners in the federal and state agencies. That's a critical piece of our success. I mean, I think Simon's work and his team are emblematic of that. I see this in the grazing retirement program work that I do in dealing with conflicts. We now have ranchers coming to me. I see it in our conflict, mitigation work with large carnivores, wolves and grizzlies in the Northern Rockies, and now in Colorado, where I'm working on the wolf issue. And even with beaver conflicts, which is, sort of an ongoing challenge for many landowners and public agencies. So I guess at the end of the day, I couldn't be more excited to watch, our work in this field in the coming couple of years. And I hope all of you are too. And I think it's time for some questions now, isn't it, Tara?
Yeah, Simon and Bob, again, thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's such a joy to work with both of you. Your work is incredibly fascinating to me, and I know for all of those who are watching today as well. So thanks again. Our audience has been submitting some great questions. So let's take a few minutes to hear what they're curious about. And as a reminder, you may submit those questions by clicking on the Q&A icon at the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And remember that if we run out of time today and are unable to answer all the questions, a team member will follow up with you after the webcast. So let's get started. Our first question comes from New Mexico, and the question is, in the Gila National Forest and Wilderness in New Mexico, there is a lot of old fencing. Why can't that be removed? And I don't know, Bob, if you want to start and
Sure.
If you both want to answer, but yeah.
Let me start, and then Simon may chime in as well. First, many wilderness areas still allow public land grazing. There are occasions wherein the enabling legislation for a given wilderness area, public land grazing may be grandfathered out. In other words, once a rancher retires or gives up that grazing permit, it is reverted back to the agency that manages that wilderness area, and that grazing permit and allotment are no longer used for livestock production. However, that is only the case with a minority of our wilderness areas, which means many still have active grazing in them. I will say, and that's why there's fences in between pastures, in between different grazing allotments. So if indeed, though, there are grazing allotments in the Gila, that are no longer being utilized. I do think there's an opportunity that we could at least help facilitate or catalyze some work from our partners in New Mexico. Several come to mind for me that I already work with, who might be able to organize the team, the effort to remove fence. Removing fence, as you saw from that flatbed trailer of that photo that Simon put up, it's a non-trivial task. It's a lot of work, and when you're in the middle of a wilderness area where you're not allowed to go in with motorized vehicles, it's all hand and horse, and so it's a non-trivial endeavor, but it is one that's very, very important. And we've done that in a few places, and so I would say, please reach out to us via the email in your registration email, and there it is. Patton just posted it in the chat box. Please reach out, and I can do a little research on the status, whether or not there is active grazing in those areas, and if there's not, I can engage some of our partners and talk about possibly removing some of that fencing. Anything to add, Simon, on that?
I think you got it.
Okay.
Great. We have another good question here that Bob, you touched on about NWF taking a science-based approach, but can you address, and I'd like both of you to give your thoughts on this, can you address what can be done when politics tend to supersede science and environmental regulations are perhaps ignored? One thing that comes to mind specifically is the border wall at the south of the border that is really an impenetrable wall, and its effect on migration. So I know it's complex, but I would love to hear both of your thoughts on what we can be doing when that happens.
Well, I'll jump in first. Politics and policy invades every piece of our work, and we certainly, we experience this daily, and I will say it's why one of the reasons NWF is so effective. We engage in the political and the policy arena as well or better than any of the big environmental NGOs that I've ever been associated with, and that's a very good thing. So there's this constant work where we're applying the best available science, and there is oftentimes resistance to applying that science. So we have to simultaneously engage at the policy and political level to deal with that. The border wall, that's a big one. There are political forces that operate in that arena that are pretty significant. That being said, I do think the voice of the collective environmental community on the border wall as a barrier, not only to human movement, but to animal movement, has reached policymakers. It's a fraught issue, and it is one that is by no means over, but it is one that we continue to address. Simon, do you have you engage with this at a local level, weekly, if not daily? Anything to add?
Sure. Yeah. I think there are situations where, we try to put most of our effort into collaboration and coming to the table. What can we agree on to get work done? That's what we spend most of our time doing, because as Bob said, that's the reality of the landscape.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if that doesn't work, there are other options, right? Like there are, and that's sort of the mobilizing, legal avenues. So I think that's kind of what it comes down to. And I think I think we have to play the long game. And that it's not, the body of science and evidence is only mounting in our favor, that these issues are detrimental to the social and environmental fabric of our society. So I think over time we just have to keep that forefront in our minds and continue to do the work to change it.
Yeah, good.
That's great. Simon, here's a question for you. Both you and Bob had talked about, ranchers coming to us and people wanting to work with us. And so the question is, how does this wildlife friendly fencing work for livestock?
Yeah. So it works very well, especially for cattle. Like we mentioned, there's just not very many sheep operations left in the West. And sheep could potentially, get out of what I've demonstrated as a wildlife friendly fence, because it doesn't fully contain all the way to the ground. But for the vast majority of our rangelands, where we have this intermixing of cattle and ungulates, the sort of, this expansive rangelands that are arid, right? So they're not producing, they're not necessarily producing suitable, they're not suitable landscapes to start producing crops on, because there's just not the water. So maintaining native habitat, so that your native grasses, your native shrubs and forbs that both cattle and wildlife are using. These types of fences are going to work in 90% of the scenarios. It's only in those circumstances, like I mentioned, where say you have your calving operation, your calving pastures where you have a ton of baby calves that you don't want to get hit by cars, you might not be able to use this fence in that situation. And honestly, in some of the fences that are on the landscape right now, some of these legacy barbed wire and woven wire fences, they are dangerous for cattle as well. I've seen cows' carcasses in fences where cattle get their legs caught and get caught and die. So it's actually arguably beneficial for cows as well.
That's great. Well, I think we have time for one more question. And Simon, I know that you do more than just fence work. You're also working on wildlife crossings. And so we had a question: what are some of the challenges to building more of these? They're widely accepted. We know that they work, but what are challenges to building more wildlife road crossings, which is also about habitat connectivity and disrupting migratory routes? And they reference, bridges like in Banff and even just north of us here in Missoula on the Flathead Reservation.
Yeah, that's a great question. So any type of infrastructure project concerning roads is really expensive, for the most part. So cost is the number one challenge. Most state transportation agencies, their primary mandate is safety, human safety, right? That's what they have to maintain, so that, voters are happy. It's like if people start going off the highway by the dozens, that's a real problem. So safety is their number one priority. It probably will remain that way. And so our job is to, work within the state policy framework and as the public community to help elevate, the wildlife needs to be a component, if not an equal component, right below human safety for state transportation organizations, that they need to have the resources on their teams that ask the questions like, oh, what about wildlife in that spot? And that's something that's really happening across the West. It's exciting. We're seeing more and more states adopt, corridor action plans, connectivity action plans, funding this work specifically through legislative funding. And so that needs to continue. And then I would also say, yes, the big flashy overpasses are what garners attention, but there are tons of opportunities to modify existing, bridges and culverts to make them more passable for wildlife and for multiple species that aren't just, the big furry ones that are charismatic, like, amphibians and reptiles. And smaller mammals and fish need those, expanded, better culverts that are not just, high flow or elevated off the floodplain and they can't get to. Like there's a lot of opportunity to kind of look at that low hanging fruit and make that better. And then in the areas where it really makes sense to come together for an overpass, then we can kind of use all those other things I mentioned to get that done.
Great, thank you. Well, we are at the end of our time, but Simon and Bob, thank you both again so much for your time today, and also for the work that you are doing every single day on the ground to benefit wildlife. You're truly making a difference, and the National Wildlife Federation is so honored to support these efforts. And to our audience, thank you, each and every one of you who have joined us today. Thank you for the excellent questions you posed and for your amazing support. As you know, the work that we do would not be possible without your support. So thanks again. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thanks for tuning in today.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.